Hello everyone, my name is David Bailey. I'm an instructor of English at Altamaha Technical College, and this is my presentation for the SWTX conference, comparing Ray Kurzweil's singularity theory to the philosophy of communism and Marxism especially, and really more what I would call proto-Marxism. Little bit of history about myself. I first encountered Ray Kurzweil at an institutional effectiveness conference in Savannah, Georgia, after a presentation Mark championed about environmental scanning and futuring. And environmental scanning and futuring is something that I still incorporate in my English classes to this very day. It's something I'm very interested in. But Kurzweil is a fascinating figure in, I would say, philosophy. I mean, he covers a lot of different fields, but the more I read about him and the more I learn about him, the more I realize that he's pretty much in the field of philosophy, and I'll explain why. Kurzweil is a pioneer in the idea of the singularity, and specifically what Kurzweil has done. Before I get into that, the singularity is the idea that technology advances at a rate that is exponential. As we get better tools and better processors and better computers, what ends up happening is we innovate and we create faster and faster and faster. And Kurzweil took this idea and especially built it from Moore's law. I mean, a lot of this stuff isn't exactly original with Kurzweil, but he's done some very specific tweaking that I'll mention a little bit later. Moore's law, of course, is the idea that the number of transistors on a processor doubles roughly, I think, every 6 or 7 months. I don't know the exact day. I don't know the exact time off the top of my head. But the point is, technological processing power doubles at a roughly predictable rate. It's a law of human ingenuity, which is really interesting if you even think about it from that perspective. Now, because processing power doubles at a pretty predictable pace, that makes for some rather large leaps in technology in a kind of a short amount of time. If you think about it, the first computers, think about the ones they had at MIT, these giant football field computers that were basically capable of, I mean, complex but basic calculations that were supposed to be quicker than a normal human could, handle it. Now jump to the present, and now we have these phones. And this isn't a smartphone, but imagine it's a smartphone for a minute. Think about all the things your smartphone can do. You can log on the web. You can actually create documents, view media files. Compare that to the size and the basic functionality of the MIT computer, in the 60s. If you really stop and think about it, that is gigantic. I mean, it's a completely different world now from what existed back then. Our capabilities to communicate have just so far outpaced what existed back then, but that's really kind of a blink in human history. And it's because processing power has this predictable doubling. Now, Kurzweil takes this idea, and to be fair, there's a lot of criticism of the idea that Moore's law is going to keep going the way that it's going, but I'm not going to worry about that here. Kurzweil takes the idea of Moore's law predictably doubling and starts predicting what technology will look like in the future. Now, it's really controversial stuff, but follow along with me for a minute. Imagine the same process. Imagine what's happening with your cell phone and what could happen even 10, 20 years in the future. I mean, I think Kurzweil actually says 10, 20 years in the future, the same functionality, probably actually exponentially more complicated, you'll probably be able to fit it in a blood cell. And when technology does that, when you can fit very complex machines into a blood cell, think about what you can do for the body itself. It's a really strange and kind of exciting but scary idea. Kurzweil also applies this concept to artificial intelligence, and this is important. Think about it like this. We improve ourselves. We improve our technology with Moore's law at a pretty predictable pace. Now, what happens if an artificial intelligence gets as smart as a human and learns to improve itself in the same type of Moore's law situation where the intelligence becomes faster more intelligent on that predictable doubling basis. What you have is an intelligence that is getting exponentially more capable than a human being, and it's basically facilitating its own evolution. Now, that's when you start getting into scary stuff, and the singularity has been classically relegated to science fiction, especially the Terminator. Terminator is actually a really, really good singularity story because it is about the artificial intelligence overcoming us and making humans obsolete. Now, what does this have to do with philosophy? What does this have to do with communism and Marxism? I believe that Kurzweil is espousing some of the very same philosophical constructs that the communists and, importantly, the proto-communists use. Now, I'm going to link these texts as best as I can below this video, so if you want to try to chase these things down yourself, you can. But when I was an undergraduate at Armstrong Atlantic State University, I had a philosophy class with Jack Simmons, I think. It's been a long time. I ran into this book, Philosophy and Myth and Karl Marx, by Robert C. Tucker. Fantastic read if you ever get the chance, and if you're interested in the origins of Marxism. Marxism is characteristically atheistic. It's very secular. In fact, I believe he looks at religion like it's a bad thing. I think he might have actually been the guy who said that religion is the opium of the masses. But the funny thing is that Marxism is built from a religious tradition, a religious philosophical tradition. Now, I've read a lot of this, but forgive me if I make some errors. But you can track Marx back to Ludwig Feuerbach. And this is the essence of Christianity. Ludwig Feuerbach. There you go. Now, Feuerbach was the person who secularized the theories and philosophy of Wilhelm Hegel. Now, Feuerbach argued that man creates his image of God, and that theology is actually anthropology. That was a very controversial idea in its day, and Hegel really didn't like it. He freaked out on Feuerbach for it. And Marx was very influenced by Feuerbach. This co-opted the philosophy of Hegel. Now, to get to the real meat and potatoes of this, we got to go to Hegel. Now, Hegel took the idea of the dialectic. And Hegel was not the creator of the dialectic. A lot of people believe he was, but he wasn't. He was still working with the tradition of the dialectic. Now, the dialectic is one of the roots of philosophical idealism. Let me explain it real quick. And I'm sure we've heard of the dialectic before, but just because I want to explain it. The dialectic breaks down the process of human history into thesis, which is the original idea or force or government or whatever it is. Antithesis comes, and the thesis and the antithesis have this little private war with each other, right? Well, maybe not private. They have this war, and they are against each other. You can break this down into a lot of modern constructs, whether it be Democrat versus Republican, Android versus Apple. I mean, yeah, it works pretty well. From the conflict of the thesis and the antithesis, you have a divine, according to Hegel, a divine synthesis in the destruction of the two, but there's part and parcel little pieces of both in what's left behind. Now, for Hegel, this process of thesis, antithesis, synthesis was a divine process of human history, meaning we were gradually making our way towards this ideal. And this ideal was kind of what God wanted us to do. Now, you could take Hegel's theories and do some really strange things with them, and Hegel kind of resisted this. He thought Prussia and Germany were the ideal government, and this is such a weird idea to me, that the process of human history had worked out the ideal, and that we were there, and then we were pretty much done. Probably the end times were coming. It's just such an alien concept to me, but that was pretty much what he believed. Now, the idea of the dialectic, as Hegel envisioned it, got hijacked. First, kind of by Feuerbach. And he talked about the dialectic, talked about, this process of history, and he secularized it. And he, went on this atheist tirade, and he was not very liked in intellectual circles. But he was very, very, he was very part and parcel of the development with Marx. Marx took the idea of dialectic and converted it to dialectical materialism. And dialectical materialism is the meat and potatoes, I love that phrase today, the meat and potatoes of communism is socialism. Now, the communists believed that we were striving towards this ideal government, this ideal society. And they used the idea of the dialectic to project history and to try to figure out what's the next step. And for them, it all came down to capitalism versus proletariat. That's where this whole conversation comes from. That's the process of human history that is being projected outward. And for Marx, this was the ideal. This was the synthesis that needed to come about. And in some ways, it was, to him, inevitable. But this was just applied dialectic. It was applied philosophy to try to see what the future looked like. So for all the atheism that Marx, puts out in his writings, it's built of a religious and almost mystic tradition of trying to project the future. Now, what does this have to do with Kurzweil? In my opinion, a heck of a lot. Kurzweil is taking Moore's law and turning it into a kind of like New Age dialectic. And it's funny because when you talk about the dialectic, there's something that's very irresistible about it. And Kurzweil does the exact same thing. He's projecting the future. And you have to understand, Kurzweil's ideas are really, really revolutionary and just kind of out there. In some circles, it's not a good idea to talk about Kurzweil because you're just going to so thoroughly blow people's minds. Now, for Kurzweil, it's not just a political philosophy that he's talking about. He's talking about the future of the form of man. And for him, the development of the artificial intelligence, the development of technology, Kurzweil's real contribution to the idea of the singularity comes from the idea that the singularity, that technology and artificial intelligence won't just develop separate from man to be thesis or antithesis, if you want to go that way, but he kind of jumps right into synthesis. Man and machine merge. And we get the book, The Age of Spiritual Machines. Now, for Kurzweil, we will become part of that intelligence. And that makes for some really weird things. Think about it like this. If you have a super advanced artificial intelligence that can make itself smaller and more powerful, you'd have that classic hackneyed science fiction image of the nanites, the small piece of technology, and that's what you could have in your bloodstream that's repairing you, and you might not even need internal organs anymore. He goes that far. That life, what he's doing, he's actually revolutionizing, he's philosophizing the evolution of man. The ideal is no longer about the society we live in, but about the form that we take. It's really strange and kind of invigorating, but terrifying at the same time. And for Kurzweil, this stuff could take us beyond death, beyond most limitations. And for me, what really strikes me about this is not just the fact that this is a new kind of repackaged dialectical materialism, a repackaged proto-socialism / Marxism, but that the philosophy surrounding it is just the fact that it actually doesn't even target the society we live in, but it targets us, the form we take. Now, Kurzweil is very much a philosopher because he's taking this kind of dialectic process and he's looking at the kind of cultural challenges and the problems that we'll have in the future, the form of man, that as he will appear, as he takes more and more control over his physical being. Now, my big concern here is that communism was an applied philosophical idealism. And it did not make good things. Many communist societies broke down. Lots of dictatorship, lots of abuse of human rights. The application of idealism is probably one of the most dangerous things in history, in society, in culture. And this is idealism that is so extreme That it's actually going after you, your form. And while it's invigorating, I think we really have to take some time to slow down and think about what types of worlds we're getting into and the consequences philosophically of this idealism in the past. Now, I'm going to leave with this. I've discovered a philosophical blog called Less Wrong that talks about these issues and kind of how we can clean up the human thought process before the singularity comes about. Now, on another note, do I believe in the singularity as Kurzweil envisions it? Not really. It's really out there. You've got things like nanites getting into the tissue folds of your brain to download the structure of your essence, who you are, to actually transfer you into another body. Like making actual physical copies of yourself. That's beyond cloning. Cloning is just making another biological version of you. With the singularity, you create another, like a potential you that you could go to later. I mean, maybe it's just that the singularity creates a world that is so far beyond our conception that we can't mentally handle it, but it's just so hard to think about these things. I think that a lot of what Kurzweil is seeing is true. The potential for these things to occur is there. But to actually commit to that image of the future when it's still, unfortunately, even though Kurzweil has all these mathematical models, Marx was just as sure that the utopia was coming. And it didn't. It was actually quite opposite of a lot of the ways that he saw things. So I would urge people to think really carefully about these things because, I mean, seriously, this could be the new paradigm, the new political paradigm of the century. The political forces that form that thesis and antithesis, and that fight could be rather brutal. And I know a lot of this sounds kind of like prophecy, but it's just philosophy, and it's a study of how philosophy and politics intermingle, and what they can do and what potential damage they can cause. For me, the reality of singularity is not as important as the consequences that might occur from people who really believe it. So while I find this stuff so interesting, I think it's important to keep it grounded and understand that this is repackaged idealism. And that's led us down some dark places in the future. Now, like I said, I'm going to try to repackage some of these links. So if you want to read more, I'll try to put a biography of Kurzweil on here. He recently had something on Wired. Try to get some of the recent writings on the singularity, link you guys to Less Wrong so you can follow up on this if you want. It's amazingly interesting, and I would love to have any conversations with you about it, especially criticism. I'm all about criticism with this stuff because it is kooky crazy. So I'm also going to include my social networking information, Twitter, if you want to try to communicate with me there. I appreciate everyone listening to my presentation in this format. I wasn't able to get out there, so thank you very much, and have a fantastic conference.